5 children walked into a church one evening and were never seen again. I need you to stay with me for the next 20 minutes because this is not a story that ends where you think it ends. The first part of the story is what happened that night. After the service ended, after the families started searching, after it became clear the children were gone. That part disturbed me. The second part of the story is what happened during the investigation, the questions that were asked, and the pattern of what happened every time someone got close to an answer. That part kept me awake. But the third part is what a former worker said. Someone who had been inside that church environment for years, someone who had stayed silent until they couldn't anymore. What they said did not sound like an accident. It sounded like 5 children disappearing at once was not the plan. I am going to tell you everything, but I need you to understand one thing before I begin. I grew up in a community like this one. I went to a church like this one, which is exactly why this story has never left me. I want to tell you something about the kind of community where this happened. Because if you have grown up in West Africa, if you have gone to church since before you could read, you already know places like this one. You know the compound, the plastic chairs set out before service, the generator humming when the power goes out, the children who run between legs while the adults greet each one after service, the way nobody locks their doors because everyone knows everyone, the way parents send their children ahead and don't worry. Because the church compound has always been safe. That safety, that deep, unquestioned, generational trust, that is the thing you need to hold in your mind as I tell you this story. Because what happened that night did not happen despite that trust. It happened because of it. For the protection of the families involved, I will not name the specific community, but I will tell you this. The events I'm about to describe were documented. They were investigated. They were discussed by people in positions of authority who made a decision I believe was wrong, to handle this quietly. This story did not stay quiet, not entirely, and today it is not quiet at all. Because what one person eventually came forward to say after years of silence changed everything anyone thought they understood about that night. And I am going to tell you exactly what he said. The service that evening was nothing unusual. A midweek revival meeting, the kind that drew a good crowd. Parents, families, young people, children. 5 children attended together that night. The youngest was 7. The oldest was 13. They sat near each other as children do. They were seen by multiple members of the congregation throughout the service. Nothing unusual. Nothing that made anyone look twice. Now, we will call one of the mothers Mercy. Mercy had sent her son that evening the same way she had sent him 100 times before. He was 10 years old. He knew the way home. He had friends at that service. She was cooking. She told him to come back before the food got cold. And so she cooked. And she waited. And when the food was cold and the compound outside was quieter than it should have been, she went to the door and she looked down the road and there was nothing coming. The moment she arrived at the church compound, she found 4 other families already there. All of them looking for the same thing. All of them with that same expression on their face. The expression of a parent who has just moved from worry into something much heavier. What followed was what you would expect. The community mobilized immediately, adults fanning out across the compound and the surrounding streets. Names being called into the dark, flashlights, neighbors, phone calls, nothing. And so they went back to the church and they began to do what you do when you cannot find something. They began to retrace. They asked everyone who had been at the service, "Did you see them leave? Which direction? Who were they with?" And this is where the evening stopped making sense because the answers did not align. Some people, confident, certain, said they had seen the children walking toward the compound gate together after service ended. Others, equally confident, said they never saw them go outside at all. And a small number, the ones who hesitated before they answered, said they had seen the children near a different part of the compound entirely, not the main hall, not the courtyard where families gathered after service, a section of the building that most members did not pay attention to during regular services. A side structure, set apart, the kind of space you walk past without looking at because it has never given you reason to look. But here is the detail that changed everything. When these witnesses were asked separately, when they did not know what the others had said, each one placed the children near that same area, not together, one by one, at different times. 5 children, one location, seen separately at different times. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And when people began asking that section of the building, who had access to it, what it was used for, who had been there that night, the answers they received were not what they expected. The answers they received were not really answers at all. The restricted area of the compound was not hidden exactly. It was simply never discussed. It had been there for years. Long-standing members of the church understood it as a space used for private ministry, prayer sessions, deliverance, counseling, the kind of activities that happened away from the main congregation, that are described as sensitive, that are positioned as requiring privacy for their effectiveness. Most members had accepted this without question, because in this kind of church, you do not question the private operations of the leadership. You trust, you defer. That is what faith looks like in practice in many of our communities. And so, that space had existed undisturbed and unexamined for years until 5 children were seen near it one by one on an evening they never came home from. Mercy asked 3 different leaders about that section of the building in the days after her son disappeared. The first person looked uncomfortable and told her the space was not relevant to what happened. The second person told her she should focus on prayer and trust God to bring clarity. The third person, and this is the one that broke something in her, looked directly at her and said, "Sister, be careful about the questions you are asking in public. Some things are better handled quietly within the church family." Her son was 10 years old. He had not come home, and she was being told to be careful about her questions. In the weeks that followed, something happened that is difficult to describe. The community began to manage the story, not with a lie, not with an open denial, but with a slow, practiced redirection that moved any serious question away from the church and toward grief, toward God's will, toward the need for patience and trust. Families who pushed were described as difficult, as faithless, as people who were allowing their pain to lead them into dangerous territory. The language of spiritual authority was used as a war, and one by one, exhausted, grieving, spiritually isolated from the very community they needed most, the parents found themselves alone with their questions. All except Mercy. Mercy did not stop asking. For almost a year, the answers Mercy received were versions of the same thing. Wait, pray, trust. And then something unexpected happened. Not from the church, not from any official authority, from someone who had been inside that system for years, someone who had watched, someone who had known things they had never said out loud, someone who had finally, for reasons I will explain, decided they could not stay silent any longer. What he came forward to say did not just describe what happened the night those children disappeared. It described a pattern, a structure, something that had been operating quietly inside that compound for much longer than one evening. And it started with a single sentence that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I first heard it. Let me describe to you the shape of what an investigation looks like when the institution being investigated is also the institution with the most authority in the community, because it does not look like the investigations you have seen on television. It does not look like pressure and accountability and truth being forced into the open. It looks like this. The families ask questions. The leadership expresses sorrow and concern. The committee is formed, made up of church members, appointed by church leadership. The committee meets. The committee produces nothing concrete. The families ask again. The leadership prays over them. A senior leader from outside the church visits once and issues a statement describing the situation as a community tragedy. The statement does not address any specific question anyone has asked. The statement is distributed. The matter is considered by those with the authority to consider such things, addressed. Meanwhile, the children are still gone. Because here is what the internal committee never examined. Here is the question that was never formally asked, never formally answered, never formally recorded anywhere. And it is the most important question in this entire story. Who had access to that restricted section of the building? Not generally, specifically. On that specific evening, who had a key? Who had permission? Who was seen entering or leaving? That information existed. It was knowable. In a church compound where everything else is managed and organized and scheduled, access to a private ministry space does not happen without someone knowing who was there. That question was never answered officially. I want you to sit with that, not because I'm asking you to assume the worst, but because in any situation where children go missing and a specific location is relevant, the question of who had access to that location is not an optional question. It is the first question. It is the question that every responsible investigation begins with. It was not answered in week 1. It was not answered in month 1. And when Mercy submitted a written request, formally with witnesses, asking that question directly to the church board, she received a written response. The response said the matter had been reviewed internally and that no evidence of wrongdoing on the church premises had been found. It did not say who had access to the building that night. It did not say who was examined. It did not say what evidence had been reviewed or how. It said no evidence of wrongdoing had been found. You understand what that means? That is not an answer. That is the shape of an answer placed where an answer was supposed to go. By the 6th month, the community had divided in the way communities always divide when an institution they depend on is being questioned. On one side, the families, Mercy, and 2 other parents who had never stopped asking. A small number of long-standing members who had begun to ask their own private questions. A few young people who had started talking in ways that made the older leadership uncomfortable. On the other side, the majority, not malicious, not complicit, simply people who had built their lives around this church, who had been married here, named their children here, buried their parents here, who genuinely could not hold in their minds the possibility that the place they trusted most had failed them in the most catastrophic way possible. And so they chose, in the way people choose without knowing they are choosing, to believe the institution. And they look at the parents who were still asking, and they said, with genuine pity in their voices, "You need to let God heal you. This bitterness will destroy you." For Mercy, that sentence from people she had known for 20 years hurt her more than the official silence did. Because the official silence she had expected, the community's turning away she had not. 12 months after the disappearance, the restricted section of the building had been quietly renovated, the interior reconfigured, the purpose of the space changed, new materials, new access arrangements. Nobody announced this. Nobody explained it. It simply happened. And when the families noticed it and asked what had changed and why, they were told the renovation was a general improvement to the facility. That was the moment everything started piecing together. Something Mercy had been resisting for a year. She said, "I had kept believing that someone in that church would eventually do the right thing. That guilt or God or something would move someone to tell the truth." When I saw that renovation, I understood the priority was not truth. The priority was continuation. The church had to keep going. And for it to keep going, certain things had to be made impossible to prove. She was right, and she was not finished, because 4 months after that conversation, someone came to her door. The person who came to Mercy's door had worked inside that church environment for 6 years. Not on the platform, not in front of the congregation, behind it, in the parts of the operation that the Sunday morning version of the church was never meant to reveal. He came at night. He asked to speak privately and told Mercy that he had been living with what he knew for over a year, and that the renovation had been the thing that made finally silence feel impossible. He said he had information about what that restricted section of the building was actually used for. And then he said the sentence that I believe is the most important thing anyone said in this entire case. He said, "The night those children disappeared at once, that was not how it was supposed to happen. That was a mistake. What was supposed to happen was that no one would ever notice." The person who came to Mercy's door, we will call the witness, spoke for nearly 2 hours. Some of it is part of a process that is still unresolved. Some of it involves people who are still living and whose names I will not put into this story. But I'm going to give you the essential things, the things that changed what this case meant. The witness described the restricted section of the building in detail. He confirmed it was used regularly, not for the general congregation, for a much smaller, much more specifically selected group of people. He described a structure inside that church. And I want you to understand, I am not talking about the Sunday morning structure. I am not talking about the worship and the preaching and the community you could see. I am talking about a structure that operated underneath that, quietly, selectively, in spaces that most members never entered and never questioned. He said children had been involved in activities in that space before. Not regularly, not every child, but across time, selected children called aside in ways that looked on the surface like spiritual mentoring, like favor, like the kind of attention parents feel grateful for when a church leader pays it to their child. He said those involvements had always been managed carefully, enough that nothing drew attention, until the night 5 went missing at once. I want to come back to what the witness said that night to Mercy, because the full weight of it is only clear when you understand everything that came before it. He said, "The night those 5 children disappeared at once, that was not how it was supposed to happen. That was a mistake. What was supposed to happen was that no one would ever notice." Read that again if you need to. No one was supposed to notice, which means 5 children disappearing was not the intended outcome. The intended outcome was something else entirely. Something quiet, something that had been happening long enough that those responsible believed it could continue to happen without consequences. 5 at once broke that. 5 at once was a mistake they could not contain. And every act of institutional silence that followed, the deflection, the committee that found nothing, the police investigation that proved nothing, the written response that answered nothing, the renovation that erased something, all of it was not grief management. It was containment. Before the witness left that night, he said one more thing. He said he was not coming forward to the authorities. He said he was afraid, genuinely afraid of what exposure would cost him personally. He said he had family members still attending that church, and that the reach of the leadership extended further than the compound walls. He told Mercy, "I want you to know that your son did not disappear because of anything you did or did not do. I want you to know that the question you have been asking, the one about who had access to that building, that is the right question. Keep asking it. Keep asking it with every tool you have, because the answer exists. The people who hold it are counting on your exhaustion to protect them." have been carrying this story for a long time. I want to tell you why I'm telling it now. Not to shake your faith. I am not here to tell you that the church is corrupt or that spiritual community is dangerous. I know what the church has meant to our communities. I know what it has built and what it has held and who it has carried through impossible seasons. I am telling you this story because this case and cases like this do not survive in silence. They survive because the silence feels respectful. It feels like honoring the institution. It feels like protecting the community. And it is none of those things. What protects a community is the willingness to ask hard questions of the things that hold power within it. What protects children is accountability, not reverence. The 5 children of that community deserve that. And so does every child currently sitting in a restricted room somewhere, being told that what is happening to them is spiritual. I grew up going to church. I still believe in what the church can be at its best. But I also know, because of stories like this one and others I have not yet told, that faith in an institution is not the same as faith in God, and that the two get confused more often than most of us are willing to admit. Because when they get confused, when we treat the institution as sacred and its leadership as untouchable, we create the exact conditions that allow what happened in that compound to happen and to continue and to be renovated over. I want to ask you something before you go, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. Is there something in your church, something you have seen, something you have heard, something that has never sat right with you, that you have stayed silent about because speaking felt like betrayal? Drop your thoughts below. I read every single one. And if this story found someone who needed it, share it, because someone in your circle right now is asking questions they are afraid to ask out loud. Give them the permission to ask.